Hello everyone, I'm Santiago, and today I'm gonna be testing the i5-4440 paired with a GTX 1050 Ti on many games. I'll try to get 60 frames per second, that's on the title of the video, so if you want to get 30 frames per second with higher graphics settings, you can do so just fine. But again, this video is about 60 frames per second, so I push the CPU as much as possible. If you want to skip to another 15 games tested, just check the timestamps down in the description, and on each of the games I'll tell you what's going on. So first of all, I'll test Battlefield 1. I'll be using a mix between medium and high settings on 1080p, and this game is very demanding, usually on 64 player multiplayer battles. So on this map I'm testing right now is usually where I get the highest CPU usage, so I'm getting 100% usage pretty much all the time. On the footage I'm showing you, there are some drops into the mid 40s sometimes, but the game itself doesn't feel 100% stable. The frame times are very inconsistent. This game can use more than 8 gigs of RAM, a little bit more. In this case, to avoid those drops in the frame rate and have more stable frame times, you'll need a better CPU and a little bit more RAM. I'll try to go over 8 GB if possible, and on dual channel. Dual channel in this game is very important, but for now what you can do is cap the frame rate at 45 FPS, and that should give you more stable frame times overall. Of course the game is still playable, but it won't hit 60 frames per second consistently with this CPU, so I'll talk to you again in the next game.
Kommst du auf die Beine? Ja. Jetzt Granate! Vorsicht jetzt!
Far Cry 5, I'll be using 1080p once again. On a mix between normal and low, shadows, geometry and vegetation will be lowered to the minimum because those are the biggest hits in the frame rate. And first you'll notice that the CPU once again can be maxed out pretty easily on this game, and the frame rate can drop below 60 frames per second. It seems to be mostly GPU bound in this case, because when you drop below 60, usually into the low 50s, the GPU usage is maxed out. Sometimes there are some drops related to the CPU, but those don't happen as usual as the GPU related drops. Usually when a car explodes, 4 or 5 enemies around trying to attack you is usually when the CPU can suffer a little bit more, but overall it was between 50 and 65 FPS the big majority of the time. I'll talk to you again in the next game.
Got it. We need to protect our own in here.
Hey there, Missy.
If he says he wants to leave Eden's Gate, then we gotta try and help him.
Good to see you, girl. What's going on,
Fuck! Peggy's at the back! I'm seeing it! Stay strong and devoted! More from the back!
You weren't made for this world!
PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds or PUBG. I'll be using 1080p with custom settings. Post-processing and shadows will be on medium, effects on low, foliage on very low, and view distance on ultra. Foliage on very low is because that affects the view distance of foliage, so if someone is trying to hide on foliage, At around 300 meters there will be no foliage at all, so it will be very easy to spot them. And while overall it was over 60 frames per second, there are some stutters here and there, especially when you first land into the game. Usually in bootcamp, when you're approaching it, there can be some stutters here and there. It seems to be a thing with the game because it happens on a lot of hardware I tested in the same places. So yeah, I think the game needs just more work to be more polished. You just need to be a little bit patient sometimes with it. Like hopefully they try to optimize it better. For now, this is what we got. So I'll talk to you again in the next game. Now I'm testing Fortnite, the Battle Royale mode, and on this one I'll be using almost the maximum settings on 1080p. Shadows will be on high and the rest just maxed out. That's enough to be between 50 and 70 frames per second. If you want to avoid some of the drops below 60, which are not a ton of them, you can lower shadows a little bit more, or just lower effects and post-processing one step below. That's usually the best way to maintain a more consistent frame rate. Personally, this configuration just works good enough for me, but if you want smoother frame rates, you can easily just lower the settings. The game runs just fine. It's not limited by the CPU, so the GPU is the culprit here. So I'll talk to you again in the next game. GTA 5. On this one I'll be doing 1080p once again, using a mix between high and very high settings. It won't be a huge graphical difference compared to the maximum settings, but the game will perform significantly better. In order to do a stress test, I'll be going into the middle of two big streets and start blowing up cars using the rocket launcher. This in my opinion is the best way to test it. A lot of explosions, the AI just going crazy, and overall it was over 60 frames per second. There might be a drop or two below 60, nothing really major if you ask me. It usually happens when there are a ton of cars cars on fire plus explosions at the same time, but the frame rate stays very consistent, so I'll talk to you again in the next game. Assassin's Creed Origins. On this one I won't be doing 1080p, it will be the 1080p resolution but 90% of the pixels. Not a big deal if you ask me, the game still looks good enough. This is just to try and maintain 60 frames per second as consistent as possible, because the GPU is the limiting factor as well. I'll show you a little bit into the open world in the Alexandria region, then I'll just go to a fight, because the CPU there suffers more than usual, so you'll see a lot of stutter when I'm trying to fight at the first. So I'll briefly just cap the frame rate at 45, and you'll notice once I do that the frame times are significantly more consistent. Yeah, there are some stutters every now and then, but they are not as bad as when you have unlocked frame rates. That's because when you limit the frame rate, you're helping the CPU do less work. So yeah, that's something very important. So yeah, in my opinion, this one, cap it at 45 frames per second, crank up the settings a little bit, and it should be just fine. I'll talk to you again in the next game.
Hej! Ty spokojne! Posidon!
Aha! Over here, brothers!
Yes, to Ptolemaios!
Time to go! Hey, what?
No help coming! You're dead!
Hey, die, worm!
To battle! Come on!
What? That's no game you play. Drop it. That's it. Die. Enough. Time is up.
You're dead!
Target lined up.
Rainbow Six Siege. On this one, like on Assassin's Creed Origins, I'll be using 10% less pixels and 1080p, so I'll be playing at pretty much 1824 by 1024, so yeah, so 90% 1080p. I did that in order to maintain a more consistent frame rate while trying to get 60 frames per second, and on this game it wasn't difficult. The game maintained over 60 pretty much all the time. Even when there were some gunfights on screen, it felt very good to play. The frame times were almost perfect. I don't have much to say about this one, so yeah, on this one the limiting factor is the GTX 1050 Ti, so in this case if you want a better frame rate, just get a better GPU or just lower the settings, but I'll talk to you again in the next game.
Op 4 drone has located the biohazard container.
Laying out the welcome. Wall secured!
They've ceased attempting the biohazard.
Changing maps!
Take out the hostiles. Op 4, last stop standing. Prevent further access to the biohazard container. Op 4 eliminated. Mission successful.
Forza Horizon 3. On this one I'll be using 1080p, using pretty much medium settings, some stuff on high, some stuff on low. You'll get the point once you watch the options menu. And I'll be going into a race with 11 opponents. Usually the performance suffers the most when there are a ton of opponents on screen. And overall the race was at over 60 frames per second. This game is very VRAM intensive, so it uses a lot of video memory, also uses a lot of RAM. In this case it was around 7.5 gigabytes of usage, but it can easily go over 8 gigabytes and it will start stuttering even more. So if you play for around an hour or more, it can use more than 8 gigabytes. But by just restarting the game, you can get to play again just fine. You'll also notice that it uses a lot of CPU, which that, including the amount of RAM we have, causes the frame time spikes. But this happens less when you're in the open world instead of an actual race with 11 opponents on screen. Overall, it was a completely playable experience. Yeah, the stutters are quite annoying sometimes, but they don't make the game unplayable. If you want to get rid of the stutter, I recommend just capping the game at 30 frames per second or 45, and once you do that, it should be more stable overall. As I said before, it uses a lot of VRAM as well. It can be at around 4 gigabytes, but by even using the lowest settings, I can go to the maximum VRAM available. It seems to just fill all the VRAM that you have on your PC and do whatever it wants, so I'm not sure what's going on with that, but I'll talk to you again in the next game. Just Cause 3, once again 1080p, using some stuff on high, and then I lower some effects like global illumination, screen space reflections, depth of field, in order to maintain a more consistent frame rate. And this is another game that uses a lot of CPU, a lot of RAM. The RAM usage can go over 8 GB, that's why when you start the game it would say that you don't have enough system memory, but you can play it anyway. There are no restrictions on that. Unfortunately, this will mean that the game will stutter more often than if you had more than 8 gigs of RAM. In this case, I just went to a couple gas stations and made them explode, because those are the biggest explosions in the whole game. Once the explosion is going on, the GPU usage will rise, the CPU usage will rise, and it will drop below 60 frames per second. But if you're just flying around or fighting some enemies, usually stays at 60 frames per second or over. But unfortunately, the frame times are quite unstable, especially when there are explosions going on. This is another one of those games that I recommend just capping at 40 or 30 frames per second. That will make the frame times more stable. But yeah, overall, even with unlocked frame rates, the game can be completely enjoyable. So I'll talk to you again in the next game. Rise of the Tomb Raider, once again 1080p, using pretty much medium settings. You can see the settings in the video itself. I'm in the village, one of the most demanding areas of the game. It uses a lot of CPU, a lot of GPU, and you get the point. Using these settings, I was into the mid 40s in the worst case scenario, but once I advance more into the level, it will start stabilizing a little bit more. Unfortunately, here the CPU is the biggest limiter in performance. If you lower the resolution to 900p, for example, the GPU will have enough room to spare in order to get 60 frames per second, but the CPU won't be enough because it's just maxed out. So no matter how much you lower the settings, you'll be at 45 in the worst case scenario in this level. So yeah, you can see the limitation, but this is the most demanding level I tried so far. So other levels should be more stable overall, but I like showing the worst case scenario. I'll talk to you again in the next game.
Lara, I'm sorry if Sophia was less than welcoming.
I understand. I'm just glad you were there to vouch for me.
My people have spent decades fighting outsiders. It's not an easy habit to break. See if you can lend a hand with the preparations. A little hard work would go a long way towards building trust.
I'll see what I can do. They will likely come from the air. Jacob is assembling fighters in the upper village to draw their attention.
The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt. I'll be using pretty much medium settings with shadows on low and texture quality on ultra, 1080p resolution. We were into the low 50s most of the time, but you'll notice that the GPU usage is maxed out. So the GPU is one of the big limiting factors in this case. If you want better performance, just lower the resolution to 900p. But sometimes due to the CPU, especially in the Novigrad area, which is where I'm just testing the game, you'll notice some spikes in the frame time. That's because the game is loading new assets. The first time you visit the place, it'll stutter sometimes, and the CPU will be almost maxed out. But still, that should be enough to maintain a constant 60 frames per second if you lower the resolution. I'll talk to you again in the next game.
Officer, taking arrest for witch hunting. Greetings, Your Honor.
Bet you're sweaty in all that armour.
What do you care?
Wouldn't you rather put on there?
How are we to fight a pestilence? Slow now.
Is there a land where I might find gold?
Hitman, I'll be using 1080p once again, with pretty much medium settings, textures on high, and my testing methodology will be just going into Marrakesh, which is the place with the highest number of NPCs I saw in this game. So yeah, there's a lot going on. Unfortunately, the frame times are very inconsistent. As you'll see in the graph, it goes up and down, up and down. That makes the game feel inconsistent with mouse movement. When there's nothing going on, you're usually over 50 frames per second, but once your cover is blown and the guards are shooting at you, it can easily drop below 50 frames per second. Usually the worst was into the low 40s, still playable, don't get me wrong. The frame times get more inconsistent and the GPU usage drops, which shows us that the limiting factor here is the CPU. If you want a more consistent experience, once again, just cap it at 30 frames per second, the CPU does less work and we get a more consistent frame time. I'll talk to you again in the next game. Counter-Strike Global Offensive or CSGO. On this one I'll be using 1080p, but since a lot of you asked me to use almost the lowest settings to see how high the frame rate can go, I lowered everything to the minimum except in textures and models. And well, once I did that, it was over 120 frames per second pretty much all the time. There can be some drops below 120, but that's when you are already dead or watching a replay, so I didn't think it was a big deal. The game was completely smooth, and I'll talk to you again in the next game. Fallout 4, I'll be using 1080p with a mix between high and ultra settings. Shadow quality and distance were on high, got rays on low because it's a big performance hit, despite being a small difference in the visual department. And from a left, I'll be looking into Diamond City, then go around the city very briefly, and it will end with a shootout with the guards. The game can easily drop into the 40s, still completely playable if you ask me. But the good thing is that the frame times are very consistent, you don't see the big spikes. So yeah, at least the frame times were consistent, but the frame rates can drop very easily. So I'll talk to you again in the next game.
Hey, who wants to look beautiful? Hairstyles from across the country.
Move along.
Swatter, who needs a swatter?
We buy and sell everything to everyone, except synths. No synths allowed here.
Prescriptions filled, high quality care.
My God.
Right here.
And finally, Batman Arkham Knight. I'll be using normal textures and the rest just lowered to the minimum, because in order to get 60 frames per second with this GPU, you need to use lower settings, because this game is very demanding on the GPU, and in this case 1080p is too much for the 1050 Ti to do 60 frames per second on max settings. And well, first of all, I'll just be flying around into the middle of the city, fight a couple people, then go into the Batmobile, start destroying some stuff around me, and finally just eject, fly a little bit, and that'll be about it. Usually the stutters happen when you're moving very fast through the map, especially in the Batmobile, or destroying stuff at the same time. Then fighting on the street and very close environments is usually fine, and the game in random moments can go over 8 gigs of RAM usage, which can lead to some stutter, but it was kinda rare. Yeah, it helps you avoid some of the stutter with the game, but it won't fix it 100%, which I'm very sad about, because it's a very fun game. Yeah, the game was patched a lot since day one, but in my opinion it wasn't enough. I remember I finished it at 30 frames per second with my 750 Ti back then. So yeah, if I could do that, you can do it just fine, using double the frame rate. So now conclusion time. Despite its age, I was expecting significantly worse performance. Yeah, in some games that use a lot of CPU, the frame times are very inconsistent, especially on Assassin's Creed Origins, Battlefield 1, Hitman, and all those games that use a ton of CPU. If you already have an i5 4440 and want to upgrade your GPU, For example, maybe you have something worse than a 750 Ti, I would say just keep the CPU if you have 8 gigs of RAM on dual channel and upgrade to a 1050 Ti, for example, or a 1060. You'll notice a much bigger difference than if you just upgrade the CPU first. As of right now, if you want to buy an i5 4440 instead, I would say it's worth it if you can buy it used at a very cheap price, since right now we have very cheap quad cores that can do the job much better, like the i3 8100. I notice more consistent frame times with that one, but yeah, that one requires more expensive RAM since we're talking about DDR4, and the used market doesn't have as many i3 8100s compared to i5's 4440. But yeah, my main recommendation here, if you decide to buy it or you own it, is to cap the frame rate at 60 if the game can maintain a consistent frame time. For example, Fortnite or Rainbow Six Siege. But on games that use a lot of CPU like Battlefield 1, Assassin's Creed Origins, I'll just suggest to cap the frame rate at 30 or at 45 in order to get a more consistent experience overall. You should be getting less stutter because the CPU is just doing less work. But yeah guys, that's pretty much it. I'll be doing this same video but using a GTX 1060 3GB, so you can see how it goes with this CPU. So that's pretty much it. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, thanks for watching and see you next time.